So you ask, has there ever been a battle in history in which one side entirely knew what the other one was going to do? What if I told you there has been? Like right down to the exact detail. They knew exactly what the invaders were going to do and exactly what they were coming with. This, folks, is the story of Operation Citadel, which was Germany's last Eastern Line offensive in World War II, starting on July 5th of 1943. This was the German army, which had been massively in retreat. This was basically the last gasp on the Eastern Front in terms of any type of attempt to regain the initiative in World War II. The Germans had 781,000 men lined up for what became known as the Kursk Offensive, which is a key city even in today's Russian-Ukrainian war. And this is where the Ukrainians have recently took the offensive. They lost it, but they actually took it again. But Kursk actually had significance many years before this, 80 to be specific, in 1943. The Russians had intercepted many encrypted German communications, mostly through spies in Switzerland. And so the KGB, or the forerunner of the KGB, had intercepted all of this communication between the German high command, and they exactly, and I mean almost down to the man, and down to the tank, and down to the artillery, knew exactly what Germany was coming to do. So this allowed the Red Army to develop a 1.9 million man defensive front. Their tanks had the Germans outnumbered about 3-1 as well. And so when July 5th, 1943 came and Operation Citadel commenced, and it was actually developed by Erich von Manstein, really one of the few generals who did not fear Adolf Hitler. But he came up with this plan, but all of the details had been intercepted by the Red Army and the KGB prior to July 5th of 1943. The result, of course, is predictable. It was an absolute Soviet rout. This failed offensive blew up in the German Wehrmacht's face so badly that this launched the full-on retreat of the German army westward. This was their high water mark in the Caucasus and in the southern Soviet Union. They retreated from a point that they would never even come close to reaching again. In fact, this retreat would continue on for the next nearly 2 years, all the way back to Berlin. Because the Red Army had this completely prepared. They knew the German attack plan almost down to the minute. The result, of course, was absolute disaster for Nazi Germany. And this was a high water mark in which it never held again. And so the Soviets had come up with their own defense, which was actually called the Kursk Defense Strategic Initiative, completely designed for exactly what happened. And the Germans lost almost half of their invading force in this attempted offensive. And the Soviets had them outnumbered about 5-1 by the time the retreat began. And even in a German Wehrmacht in which retreat was usually not approved by Hitler, in this case they had to defy him and do it. Again, Manstein was not afraid of Hitler, And so he felt like he could order this retreat without any repercussions, which wound up being true. But this is the one case in history in which the defenders knew exactly what the invaders were up to, thanks to intercepted communications, which is kind of where the KGB got its reputation off of this event, because they were wickedly good at what they did here. Again, intercepting communications from the Germany High Command with their own spies in both Switzerland and Austria, as it turns out, which is not very far from the Ober-Salzburg, where Hitler had his Alpine retreat and often would run the army from. So wireless communications was not very difficult to do here. And the KGB kind of cut its spy teeth in this particular operation. A massive, tremendous intelligence success, the likes of which hadn't been seen yet to this point. Which was an interesting comeback, considering that the Russians were completely taken by surprise in 1941 when Operation Barbarossa invaded the Soviet Union, completely caught by surprise, where they knew absolutely nothing about what was coming in. This is the date, and so between 1941 and 1943, the KGB had pulled a complete 180 from not knowing anything about an invasion to knowing everything about an invasion. They knew everything, from how many soldiers would be advancing, to how much artillery they would be carrying, to how much in tanks they had. And so the Russians were able, with their vast resources, which of course Hitler discounted, because again he believed that the Russians were Untermenschen, or subhuman. And he believed that all Germany had to do was have the correct fighting spirit. And the Soviet Union would crumble like a house of cards. Well, it's pretty hard to make a defensive army crumble like a house of cards when they know exactly what you're coming with. The element of surprise that they had in 1941 had completely evaporated by 1943. The Soviet KGB just knew everything. They knew the entire German battle plan. They could have conducted it themselves if they had felt so inclined. But instead they came up with a strategic defensive. The Kursk initiative was uniquely Soviet. And they used their numerical resource advantage to the hilt on this one. And so when July 5th, 1943 came along, there was no surprise this time. And so this is the one time in history where a defending army knew exactly what the attackers were doing, exactly what they had, exactly what they were coming with, and exactly what the battle plan for capturing the target, which in this case was the city of Kursk. And the shock of the retreating Germans was palpable. And as such, this is the story of the one time in history where the defenders knew exactly what the attackers were going to do, where the element of surprise was literally zero. There's never been a situation like this before or since. Even the Iranians, when we bombed their nuclear facilities last year, had some sort of a hint that this was coming. And thus they built their nuclear reactors underground. Now, they didn't know to what extent the American bunker buster bombs were capable of, but nonetheless, they at least had some preparation for it. Even in a case of a wildly successful operation such as what the U.S. Air Force pulled off in this case, Iran had some foreknowledge that the U.S. was going to do this. The Soviets had all of the intention, all of the opposing capabilities known, all of the weaponry known, all of the manpower known. Even in the most wildly successful operations in history, the defense had some sense of what was coming. Even Pearl Harbor had some sense of what was coming. The American battleships that they were trying to sink were not in port that day. And so even the defensive knowledge was modestly existent there. In this case, in Operation Citadel, the defenders knew it all. And I mean it all. So there it is, the one time in world history where a defense knew exactly what was coming. The only time since, and the only time leading up to it. Happy Friday, Junior, you all. Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy your Friday. I'm ready for it. It's been a long, hard week. As I always tell everybody, peace out, homies. And if you're up here in the Northland, stay warm because it's freezing cold out there. Talk to you later.